Rory is the Senior Vice President of Global Business Development and Client Success for PSI. He helps PSI's global credentialing and education clients meet their testing, education, and strategic goals through the suite of services offered by PSI while leading a team of business development, account management, marketing, and consulting professionals. During his career, Rory has worked with over 800 testing organizations, including well-known universities and colleges, licensing bodies, and renowned certification programs. Rory received a PhD in organizational leadership from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. He holds an MBA from the Drexel University and BA in psychology from Millersville University. Finally, he holds a certified associative execution, senior professional in human resources, and project professional certifications. Attendees, thanks for being with us. As a reminder to all of you, this conference is being recorded. We will have QA at the end of the presentation. Please use the QA tool if you have a question for the speaker. The stage is all yours, Rory. You can now share your content and unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and sorry that I preempted your introduction slightly there by interrupting. My apologies. And again, hopefully everyone can see my screen. I really appreciate, first off, thanks to XtremeLabs and Mari in particular for the invitation to speak today. It's great to be with you all for this discussion about experiential learning. And what I thought I would do today is really discuss the relationship between some of the events that are currently ongoing as the world continues to adapt and react to everything that we've experienced with the COVID-19 crisis, and link that to some of the trends that we're seeing with regard to experiential learning, and then also, of course, my area of focus, which is assessment, and how assessment can both undergird and support some of those learning journeys that we are seeing individuals engage in. So without further ado, just let me talk very briefly about the current skills gap and really how that's transformed in particular through this time of COVID. I actually gave a keynote recently at the International E-Assessment Conference and Awards celebrating the Champions of Change event, where I focused my keynote on the skills gap and really how that has evolved. Now, we've been talking about the skills gap for probably a decade or more at this point. So I realize this is not a new concept whatsoever. And indeed, some of you may be tired of hearing about the concept. But what we have found in the wake of COVID, and in particular this year, as individuals have moved from this kind of time of crisis to becoming incredibly mobile in how they move about between organizations, the whole, as it was termed by one article, the Great Resignation, and as individuals either try to identify alternative working paths or check out of the workforce altogether, the skills gap has truly evolved into a crisis. We have a set of individuals who still continue to struggle with finding a job and a career in the wake of being displaced by last year's and this year's events, while at the same time we have many organizations who continue to cry out for individuals and really look to find employees that just are not there because of a lack of some skill sets. Indeed, the continued challenges by post-secondary institutions to prepare people for 21st century jobs, this has existed for some time, but this has simply been exacerbated, and a greater spotlight has been shown on this issue in the last several months, and in particular. Through the course of the pandemic, a number of employers have really focused on adding in skills training or other types of educational endeavors, both to equip their workforce for some of the things that have changed during this time, or indeed to retain elements of that workforce. Indeed, a study that was done by the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants found that 65% of employers found that COVID heightened the skill gaps in their organizations, and indeed a number of them invested in some type of training. This might be temporary measures such as giving training related to some of the workplace changes. It might be much more broad, and training initiatives that we've seen, for example, from some of the large tech organizations like IBM, AWS, and Microsoft. That said, despite those efforts, that same study by CIMA found that 31% of employees spent time during the pandemic seeking further training. Now, this, of course, has really contributed to the gap and some of the crises that we've seen with organizations trying to find appropriate individuals with the right skill sets during this time. Further, the reaction in the wake of COVID has also exposed even deeper gaps amongst women and minorities, with the skills gaps in some of those communities being even greater when examining the need to add diversity and equity, inclusion within groups, within organizations, as they look to add diversity to their teams and bring greater rounded thought within their organizations. Now, I'm sure I don't have to convince many of you on the need and the issue that undergirds this gap, but really, why does it matter and what's important here? A recent report by PwC and the World Economic Forum found that if this skills gap were closed and effective investments were made in order to stem the tide here, this could boost global GDP by 6.5 trillion by 2030. I had to look up to make sure I had the right amount of zeros here, in fact, because it's just baffling, that differential in terms of what we could be looking at from a global economy with just this particular issue. Just to give a bit of scale, the US government budget was about this number in 2020. So it's an immense amount that could be brought to bear if this issue were properly closed. Analysis in the same report showed that failing to close the gap could cost, for example, China up to 1.7 points from its average growth rate. Mexico and South Africa could lose 1.8% from their GDPs, and indeed larger economies stand to lose even more. Almost 1 trillion in the United States and about $250 billion in Germany. Now, at the same time, what we've also found is that reskilling initiatives increasingly being invested in by governments, technology organizations, and the like have incredible payoff in terms of their results with both organizations and country-based or state-based, territory-based initiatives, etc. These metrics truly are compelling when we look at the cost of reskilling compared to the cost of inaction. Indeed, a number of organizations have demonstrated through research that these reskilling initiatives generally pay for themselves rapidly due to the cost of training, onboarding new employees, and of course the administrative costs that center around all of these efforts. When we look at even more expensive and in-demand roles, such as, given Megan's presentation right before this, data scientists or software engineers, indeed reskilling initiatives can pay for themselves up to 6 times over. So with that efficacy in mind, just a few thoughts around why experiential learning and why that is optimum to fill the gap. So first off, I hope I don't have to convince this group of the value of experiential learning. Indeed, this is something that's been around for quite some time. We can go back to the words of Aristotle, which said that the things that we have to learn before we do them, we learn by doing them. And indeed, this is common sense in some ways, but still difficult to embed broadly into our educational system. And in the past, the pathway to economic opportunity was too often painted with a false dichotomy, the pursuit of formal and traditional learning, or on the other hand, work experience and tracking into vocational education. Indeed, we find that increasingly the best way to bridge these gaps is through the combination of traditional education and real world work experience, both the theory and the application, indeed that definition of experiential learning. Fortunately, of course, access to these opportunities are not evenly available to all groups. We've also seen a resurgence of some very traditional experiential learning models, whether this be apprenticeships, cooperative education, or internships. Some of these programs have grown incredibly in recent years as these gaps have more completely been identified. Fundamentally, at this point, what we see out there in the landscape is that the traditional educational and learning systems are not enough to really fill these new skills challenges. So how do those gaps get bridged? And there's some great examples of how that can occur and case studies where those gaps have been bridged. A great example of this is by partnering, again, between a traditional education and a work placement route. And one example of that is between Toyota, who is a longtime client of PSI's within our talent measurement group, and the Federation of Advanced Manufacturing Education. They have a unique approach that pairs technical education with safety behavioral learning and professional learning, which might be termed as soft skills training, in order to create a pipeline of manufacturing technicians, which indeed with the automation of manufacturing lines becomes a critical role for their organization to make sure those lines keep going. They pair the technical training within the classroom with applied instruction and actually multiple days on a shop floor. In addition to that, they layer in both technical and soft skills assessments to verify that these skills are being retained. There was a great article about this program just about 8 months ago in the Washington Monthly magazine that shows how this program has effectively reached both new secondary school graduates, channeling them into these careers, as well as helping to reskill workers who are shifting from one career to another. This transition that's occurring right now is absolutely critical. Accenture conducted a study just a couple of years ago, which of course recent events has only accelerated this trend, showing the redistribution of workers from one role cluster to another. And you can see there's several different clusters identified here, management and leadership, empathy and support, as well as science and engineering, being three of the areas where the greatest shifts are occurring. To many individuals, they'll see something like this and say the response to the skills crisis is simple. We need to, train more engineers and raise the number of graduates that can address leadership roles. But of course, creating these large groups of individuals with these defined skill sets is difficult. Indeed, what's observed is that it's critical to invest in certain areas of skills that are rising in importance across a variety of different job roles. Creativity, socio-emotional intelligence, and complex reasoning are three of the most in-demand skills that we can see consistently across these role groupings. And of course, these are not skills that are necessarily taught today in these learning systems. Rather, they're acquired through practice, through experience, and often across longer term periods. Now, this blend of skills required within these various roles is also becoming more complex, thus requiring a greater emphasis on broadening the variety of skills within each worker. Again, an element that is much more readily done within experiential learning versus some of the traditional elements of formal education. We have seen tremendous investments in not only some of these soft skills areas, but also in digital skills. Some of this has been achieved through private and public partnerships. Other has been achieved through organizations creating their own resources. For example, creating specific initiatives to invest in the global workforce and in key areas, again, of skills focus. We've seen this, for example, from AWS, as they stated during their reInvent conference last year that bridging the skills gap will require intentional, sustained efforts by both the private and public sectors. They've created an initiative to provide 29 million people globally with technical cloud computing training by 2025 through providing free training courses and labs, that experiential learning in action there, linked with preparing people for AWS certification. And again, I'll get back to that assessment link in just a moment. Now, this has also been paired with a program to help those from underrepresented communities upskill and transition into those technical roles. We've also seen this on behalf of other organizations in the technology arena. Microsoft, with their Global Skills Initiative, is another example of this, where they are aiming to provide more than 25 individuals free access to learning paths and content, as well as low-cost certifications and job-seeking tools, as they look to invest in the key areas of privacy, cybersecurity, data analysis, machine learning, AI, cloud, and software development skills. So with all of this stated, all of this groundwork with regard to the skills gap and how that needs to be addressed through experiential learning, it's important to reference that learning is not enough. Learning without assessment is like teaching your teenager how to drive without having them take that driving test and making sure they're ready to get on the road. The movement to do away with assessment, I find as I have some of these conversations with individuals, has largely been driven by poor assessments, poor experiences with those assessments, or educational systems that are geared toward teaching to the test, rather than utilizing assessment for the formation of the individual and again to contribute to their skill set. Assessment can actually play an important role when done properly in the process of learning and motivation. And the types of assessment tasks that we can use really should be targeted toward how they approach their learning and indeed help them form behaviors that they can utilize in their work. Higher education scholar John Briggs said this well in that he said, quote, "What and how students learn depends to a major extent on how they think they will be assessed. And indeed, we've seen this play out certainly in a number of ways over the past years. It's important to look at how assessment can involve both formative and summative assessments, both as really a mix of these in order to provide consistent feedback to learners throughout their experience. A system of well-constructed formative and summative assessments allows students to both demonstrate their abilities and knowledge, as well as reflects how close they are to meeting their educational goals and their standards. When these two elements, the learning and assessment, are aligned, it does provide the opportunity for those who are providing the education to give students feedback on where their gaps are, and again, help this loop to contribute to their continued skills nurturing. The assessment process itself also helps students develop critical thinking and analysis skills. And I mentioned those complex analysis skills being one of the key areas that we see within the skills gap. Students who assess themselves are learning and improving their cognitive skills while this assessment is happening. And again, this also contributes to their ability to learn, adapt, and grow in the future. So before I have to close, I know I do want to leave some time for questions here. This is really where, when we talk about experiential assessment, where performance-based testing becomes so critical. And one of the most major measures there is fidelity. This is truly the way in which an assessment duplicates the actual conditions or task being performed. It's how we move from tell me what you know to show me what you know, from recall to application. And indeed, there is a rich tradition of these assessments. There's a number of different presentations that talk about performance-based testing in a lot more detail. So I will not try to recreate those in a very brief amount of time here. But it is important to continue this drive on performance-based assessments such that we can continue to see the benefits of that link between experiential learning and assessment. This has been no more clear than in healthcare and in technology, wherein a variety of different methods, whether it is more traditional, such as board interviews, such as task-based assessments, or indeed more exotic, the use of virtual reality and augmented reality in order to emulate healthcare situations. Again, we see this as providing significant advantages in those links between assessment and learning. There's a variety of different ways to approach these assessments. And indeed, right here, you can see just a few examples ranging from your live environment, actually performing the task in a pure real life endeavor that is then graded, to simulations, portfolio assessments, all the way down to the more traditional assessment types, such as multiple choice. Indeed, the more that we can continue to both have assessments with high fidelity, but also with high validity and reliability, fulfilling some of the important psychometric parameters that we have to measure, the better off we are at creating that greater link between experiential learning and assessment, and continuing to fill those skill gaps that exist in these critical arenas. I know I've tried to cover a lot here in a very limited amount of time. I would love to, talk a little bit more about some of these elements, and indeed, in just a moment, I'll provide my contact if you'd like to get in touch with me afterward. But, in summary, I would really urge the linking between experiential learning and assessment, creating those obvious connections for learners to show the link between their learning and training paths along with the assessment results. Ensuring that these assessments are based on current practices through the use of job analyses or other types of measures that delve into what is being performed on the job, and keeping them up to date, particularly in these fast-moving, fast-evolving times. Exploring how these assessments can be broken down to better reflect the skill set focus out there right now. These can be done through a variety of different methods, but micro or stackable credentials are two key ways of doing this. And again, each of those are worthy of their own discussion. And finally, again, trying to focus on skill development and really the use of both learning and assessments for those endeavors, not just simply teaching to a test or an achievement.